All right, I want to welcome everyone. My name is Mark Beckwith. I'm one of the founders of Bishops United Against Gun Violence and currently work as Bishop Liaison to other participant groups working in the gun violence prevention space. And over the course of time, we've decided that we would engage the network of Bishops United Against Gun Violence and others around specific issues. And it was determined by the membership that we should talk about suicide. And we have three people here this afternoon who are going to do that with us and talk about it from their own unique perspective. Before I introduce them, let me offer a prayer. Gracious God, thank you for gathering us together for the ministry to which you've called us, where we offer our hope, our witness, our solidarity, and our commitment to reducing gun violence. Today, particularly, we address the issue of suicide, which is the more than half of gun deaths in America. And we pray that what we hear and what we learn, we might be able to apply in our own communities and in our own lives. So we ask for safety, we ask for strength, and we ask for your help. In your name we pray. Amen. So who we have here this afternoon, Dr. Jennifer Stuber, who is Associate Professor of Social Work at University of Washington in Washington State and the founder of Forefront. As it was sent out to people, she was featured in a New York Times article around gun suicides about a year ago. She and I met at a suicide conference about 3 years ago and has really been a leader, not just there in Washington, but around the country, around the whole issue of suicide. And so she's going to speak first, followed by Elizabeth Cervasio, who is the Missioner for Children, Youth, and Family Ministry in the Diocese of Colorado. And the Diocese of Colorado has developed a curriculum around suicide and that we have promoted through the BUAG network. And so she's going to speak to what they've been doing and what they've been learning. And then finally, Sawyeh Maghsoodloo, who is the Director of Staff Policy and Communications for the Community Justice Action Fund. And CJAF is, to my mind, the primary gun violence prevention group in the country working with Black and Brown communities exclusively. And Sawyeh will be joined, we think, by Greg Jackson, who was with us in a webinar about a year ago. He's the executive director of CJAF. So each of them is going to talk sequentially. And when then at the end, we'll have a chance for questions and comments, and I will facilitate that. When we get to that point, we'll invite people to raise hands on their screen, and I'll call upon each person in succession. So Jen, want to start with you. And you're not unfamiliar with the Episcopal Church, as we had in our Subway lunch some 3 years ago. So welcome and thank you for being a part of this this conversation.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you all for having me here. I grew up going to an Episcopalian church with my family, and just really appreciate the potential role that you all can play in the issue of suicide prevention. I come at this work from wearing a couple of different hats. I think first and foremost, I'm an advocate. And that's really confusing to people because I'm also a university-based professor, and apparently sometimes it's hard to do both. But you know, I'm an advocate because here I was trained at a fancy university on the East Coast, getting a PhD in public health, and then I was, you know, recruited to come out to a very fancy school of social work on the West Coast, training, you know, frontline providers who are going to be working in mental health fields about you know, mental health policy and healthcare policy. And I received zero training as in the issue of suicide prevention, or the issue that the epidemic of suicide, despite all my training and who I was speaking to. And it wasn't until, or trying to, you know, teach, that being social workers. And so it wasn't until I actually lost my own husband to suicide in 2011, At that time I had a 1 and a 5-year-old child, that I kind of woke up and said, wow, we're really not talking about this subject enough, and have really kind of dedicated my professional career, my personal advocacy work to the issue of suicide prevention since then. And I feel like I've learned a lot. My husband did end his life with a firearm, and we did not own firearms in our home at the time of his death. So he was one of the rare people who went out to purchase a firearm with the intent to kill himself. And so I guess a couple of comments I wanted to make about this is that, what most people don't realize, so about half of all suicides in the US are by firearm, and that includes youth suicides. And most people don't realize that suicide is the second leading cause of death amongst young people today, and it's increasing. And in fact, I actually like to say, I think it's more accurate that suicide is the leading cause of death amongst young people, because when we disaggregate unintentional injuries, which is the leading cause of death amongst young people, when we disaggregate them out into, drowning and accidental poisoning and car crashes, I mean, suicide actually claims more lives than any single one of those things, including car crashes. And so it's like, to me, it's like baffling, that we don't talk about this issue more than we talk about than we do. And I think it's changed, in the last decade that I've been working on this. I definitely see more intention around it. And I definitely see more attention to it even being paid by firearms owning communities. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that we have to raise awareness about the fact that, like suicide is really the leading type of firearm fatality. So Mark, you mentioned about 50% of firearm fatalities are suicides. Actually, the statistic is 50% of suicides are with a firearm, but actually 2/3 of firearm deaths are suicides. And in our state, and I think probably in Elizabeth's state, it's more like, 4/5. So it's like when we talk about gun violence, which is actually a term I'm going to discourage people from using. I know it's completely probably ridiculous for me to ask that, but when we talk about, because how we talk about these issues is so important to firearms owners, and we really do have to reach them with the messages around suicide prevention and safe storage in a way that's going to be meaningful and heard by them. And so I have been involved in this journey for a while now, and what I would say is, oh gosh, what do I even want to say at this point? Like, I think there's a huge role for faith-based communities to play. You all, as leaders in your faith-based communities, I think you play a critical role in knowing how to respond to people who are in crisis, because oftentimes you are going to be the person that is the comfortable person to seek out. And then I think, there's a huge role for people in your community to be educated about suicide prevention, which is also a way to educate people about firearm safety and, the different, and I mean, when I say firearm safety, I want us to be really specific about that. Like talking about, not just about locking firearms, but also about what are the other tools that are really kind of secondary, but are available to people in crisis. So your extremist protection orders, which is frankly another phrase that drives people who own firearms crazy. So it's one that we should really talk about. Voluntary waivers, whatever is in your state that you have available, safe storage laws. Like, we have to educate our communities about what the available options are and how to actually access them. Because in Washington State, for example, we have a lot of laws on the books now, and many of them are not being utilized. And in fact, they're being disregarded in communities where there are lots of firearms owners. And so I think there's just a lot of work to do to kind of change the normative environment around this issue. And I think, people do want to talk about, well, no one wants to talk about suicide, but like when you start to, so one of the big projects I'm involved in right now is around developing a training by parents for parents about the topic of suicide prevention, which intersects directly with talking to them about practical things they can do right now in their house to make their home safer. And by the way, a nice coupling is to couple firearms conversations with medications conversations, because we all have improvements we can make in the realm of suicide prevention. if we think about the numbers around opioid overdose that we're seeing on the news right now, we can very easily have the conversation that we all have work to do. Like all of us have, unlocked medications and large supplies around our house, which pose a risk to young people and others who may be at risk for suicide. And so I do think there's a lot of work around messaging. And I think, critically, I want to leave you all with the message that there's a lot you all can do, both as leaders, helping people in crisis, but also as making sure your congregations, your communities are really well informed about these issues and can take practical steps and feel confident to support someone. Like one of the key messages when I'm out training in whatever community I'm in is that everybody knows somebody at risk. Like if you look at the list of risk factors and warning signs, you're walking around with your eyes closed if you don't know somebody who could benefit from a really caring conversation about how they're doing and about maybe what might be going on for them in terms of thoughts of suicide. Thoughts of suicide, by the way, are extremely common and are increasing, especially with COVID. And that is the time to be having these conversations. Ideally not when someone is at the cliff, like, really intent and, with specific means to end their lives like a firearm. So I guess I'll wrap up because I think I only had 10 minutes, right, Mark? So I think I'm about that mark. Hopefully something I said made sense, but I'm happy to take any questions. And I guess as Mark has also said, I did reach out very proactively to the National Rifle Association and to the Second Amendment Foundation here in Washington State, and we were able to get some pretty significant funding for public awareness campaigns around suicide prevention that really had a lot of buy-in from the firearms owning public. And we're still distributing locking devices in very large quantities. And we're doing a brief intervention around safe storage that we're now offering both in person and tele as well. And I'm trying to get that kind of embedded within the VA healthcare system. So I continue to do work on this issue, but again, I think how we talk about this issue is vitally important. And I think you all have a huge role to play.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you very much. Your passion and your commitment is really inspiring. Elizabeth, you have a curriculum in the Diocese of Colorado, and you work with young people and families. And tell us about your perspective.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me here. So yeah, I don't come to you today as an expert in the field, but rather as the Missioner for Children, Youth, and Campus Ministries in a state that has a sad history and present with gun violence and suicide. So Colorado, unfortunately, seems to be a state that kind of leads the way with tragic loss of life through gun violence with, you see Columbine High School, which was one of the first mass shootings in schools that was in the public eye, but it hasn't been our only one. You saw the Batman movie shooting in Aurora, which, we started to realize our lives could be in danger just by enjoying a night out. And this year we had the King Soopers shooting in Boulder, which made us realize that you could be shot and killed grocery shopping. And I think mass shootings are happening at an alarming rate in our state, but suicide is also happening at an alarming rate. It is, according to the recent statistics, Colorado ranks number 5 out of states in the nation. And like Jen said, it's the 7th leading cause of death in our state and the 2nd amongst young people. In 2019, there were 1,312 deaths by suicide. The rate of suicides among veterans and young people is above the national rate in Colorado. And of those 1,312 deaths, 76% were by firearms, which is primarily among white men and then followed by Native American men. And there's some research being done thinking that firearms is more common in rural areas, which is concerning for Colorado because a lot of our state is rural and a lot of rural areas have higher percentages of households that have firearms. And there has been an uptick in firearm sale with the pandemic. So Suicide attempts by firearms are much more likely to be fatal and leave a smaller window of opportunity. And, you know, I could sit here and give you statistics for my whole allotted time, because unfortunately there is enough to fill that time. But what I really wanted to talk to you about is the unique position that the church has for prevention. Now, there are a lot of wonderful courses out there for recognizing warning signs and how to intervene when someone is in crisis mode. But, and those are absolutely a million times over worth taking. And the more people that have that knowledge, the better. But in the Episcopal Church in Colorado, we're trying to take action sooner before those warning signs are there and before intervention is needed. We're trying to help our people become comfortable talking about a subject that is in its very nature uncomfortable. We've set up some reality areas in the diocese that we've deemed important to lean into and become more aware of. They're climate change, honoring and protecting creation, racial oppression, becoming beloved community, LGBTIA diversity, welcoming and inclusion, and then suicide crisis, bringing hope and preventing suicide. And so we have been having passionate people and experts walk with us and meeting us where we are, challenging us to grow and learn in these areas. And by inviting these people into this work with us, it is really helping us to make realities that sometimes go unseen, make them visible and make them important. And we're having those hard conversations, raising that awareness to take some of that stigma and pain away from these realities. So we have a youth leader in our diocese who, when multiple schools in her youth group were affected by suicide deaths in just the span of a few weeks, she decided to do a bunch of research and take a bunch of courses and really try and figure out why our young people were choosing to die by suicide. And she realized that while there are a lot of resources out there and a lot of trainings that people can take for those warning signs and interventions, that there wasn't a whole lot out there for the protective factors and protecting those preventative factors that can be in lives. And so she realized that the church can and should have a crucial role in those protective factors. And so she came up with a program called Rooted. And this program, basically it sees our lives like we're trees. And we all have a set of deep roots that dig deep into the soil of our lives and keep us grounded and strong. But life has a way of uprooting us. And, you know, things like sickness crop in, the economy shifts, we lose relationships, and the ground underneath us doesn't feel quite as stable or solid. And the hope is that we have enough deep roots that when one root is uprooted, we don't fall over and our tree is still firm and protected. But unfortunately, that's not always the case. And some people may not even be aware that they have roots at all. So the Rooted program shows that our roots develop naturally over time as we live. The first one that we develop is our family root. We're born into it. And then our friends root and our community root. And as those roots kind of dig in, our passion root develops. And that is made of things that we do for joy and share with others. Based on where life takes us, our school or vocation or career root grows. And then there's the generosity root, which is how we share our gifts with others, and our relationships root, which is namely significant others, partners, and spouses, and that grows as we age. Our health root is always present from birth. And when we find our faith root and when that develops, it is a critical preventative factor. So if we don't do the work to tend to these roots to ensure that they are healthy, we run the risk of losing them. And sometimes a root is created and developed in an unhealthy environment, and it takes even more care, takes extra care. So for some, the loss of one or more roots is enough to trigger suicidal crisis. And I mean, let's face it, it's a very rare moment in life when all of our roots are doing well. And life is messy and unpredictable. And we may lose roots suddenly without warning. We may lose them over time due to neglect. But the Rooted program believes that knowledge of your roots and practical ways to care for them is critical, is vital in developing resilience. And developing resilience is vital in preventing suicide. So while Colorado does unfortunately have a tragic past and present right now with both gun violence and suicide, the Episcopal Church is really doing all that it can to make the future brighter, hopefully, with that.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you for sharing the full array of what you're about in Colorado. Sawyeh from Community Justice Action Fund and your work and your perspective. Welcome to you.
Thank you. First, I'll perhaps introduce my organization a bit for those who are unfamiliar. My name is Sawyeh Maghsoodloo. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the State Policy and Communications Director. I'll say before I came to the gun violence prevention movement about a little more than 5 years ago. Prior to this role, I'd been working in this movement because I survived a mass shooting at my undergrad university in Isla Vista in 2014. And quickly I learned the statistics of that, nearly 2/3 of gun deaths in the United States are suicide. And it seemed like something that was not being talked about to the extent, to the proportion that it makes up the problem. And so I spent 5 years doing research for gun violence, and now have been with CJAF for just about 3 or 4 months, helping to grow our policy agenda around several issues, one being our approach to suicide prevention. So what CJAF does is we specifically are trying to end gun violence in Black and Brown communities, and to do so by investing in communities and helping to bring attention to the fact that gun violence prevention has to be more than just conversations about the hardware. We certainly do need to have conversations about the hardware, but policies that invest in community-based solutions are those that end this crisis long-term and in a sustainable way, is what we believe. So to talk about suicide, that's that large slice of the gun violence pie. Because I worked in research, I'm going to talk probably in a lot of statistics, but I think that it's important to frame the problem, because to understand the scope of a problem is to be able to adequately solve it. Some of the things that shocked me most was one, that we need to face that this is a uniquely American problem. Gun suicide rate in the United States is 10 times higher than other high income countries. Gun violence in general is a uniquely American problem, but gun suicide as well. And while many gun owners purchase their firearms with the intent to protect themselves or their family, we also need to talk about the fact that access to a gun triples the risk of death by suicide for not only the gun owner themselves, but everybody in that household. So there's almost a messaging problem with guns, that when families and gun owners are purchasing their guns, we need to do better at communicating the associated risks with that decision, that purchase decision. I also want to call attention to the growing crisis among youth, which I think presents an opportunity for intervention too. The firearm suicide rate among young people has gone up 42% in the past decade. And I think that research is showing that there are some clear, pretty easy intervention points there as well, because many of the youth that are dying by gun suicide are not old enough to own a firearm themselves. They're often accessing their parents' firearms. And so Jennifer mentioned secure storage, one of many tools in the tool shed, but an important one. We know that if parents or gun owners in general lock up their firearms, store the ammunition and the guns separately. And by the way, 52% of gun owners do not lock up their firearms. We know that if they did, it'd be saving lives. Up to, I think the latest was 68% reduction in suicide among youth in households that do begin to lock up their firearms. Another, I think, easy intervention is lethal means counseling, which is a fancy way of saying for healthcare practitioners and mental health practitioners to simply ask a person in crisis whether they have access to a firearm when they express that they're in crisis. And I think that that can apply to the faith community as well, or anybody that's in a position where someone has confided in them that they're in crisis. The first thing I always do is ask, do you have access to a firearm, and can I help you store that somewhere else for the time being? Or can we figure out how we can just remove that access in the same way that we were talking about lethal doses of medication? It is something that people usually know to do when someone's in crisis. But the firearm is a piece that I think we need to help reduce the stigma of just asking the question. Firearm suicide is also a growing crisis in communities of color. The suicide rate among Black youth has been increasing faster than any other racial or ethnic group in the past decade. And Black youth 13 years old and younger, in those preteen years, are twice as likely to die by suicide than their white peers. Of course, the majority of firearm suicide deaths do fall among white men, but that doesn't mean that we should ignore intervening in this growing group, growing crisis. I think that's kind of all that I had to say for now, but I'm happy to talk more when we get to the Q&A section. You're still on mute, Mark.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you for that, Sawyeh, and for your commitment and revealing your story and the commitment that CJAF has in this, in reducing gun violence, especially in the growing incidents in Black and Brown communities. And before we get to questions and answers, I see Greg Jackson has joined us. Greg is the Executive Director of Community Justice Action Fund. And I remember when there was a bill that Biden was talking about, new president, talking about this bill and the need for it. And he cited Greg in the Rose Garden as someone who's been working on this and indeed as a gun survivor. So Greg, if anything that you want to add to what's been said so far.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and thank you all again for being here. I come to this work as a survivor of gun violence, and as much as I'm proud and excited about what we've accomplished, I always have regret that I even had to become this activist, and unfortunately, every day there's so many more folks added to the list of people who have been impacted directly or have lost a loved one to gun violence. And, it's just surrounding our community, especially the Black community, at every turn. Yesterday, one of the most influential rappers in Tennessee was shot and killed while he was just shopping for cookies, literally cookies, and was shot and killed. And while it may be a headline to most, for the Black community, that touches so many folks. One of my workout partners went to high school with his partner, and now to watch his partner, Mia, who has to take care of the children alone, was devastating. And we're starting to just see the ripple of just one life loss and how it can shatter and impact so many people across the community. And we kind of go through that over and over and over again. Gun violence is now the #1 cause of death for Black men and for Black youth. And, just yesterday at dinner, having to talk to fellow Black men about what happened. And it's like, well, man, we don't know if we're next, and it's just an ever present danger and threat, no matter what walk of life you're in and what your conditions and situations are. And I do think that threat of being taken out by homicide, in addition to all the other pressures of the world, plays a direct impact on suicide too, and that feeling of hopelessness and vulnerability that a lot of folks suffer with. And so I'm glad we're talking about suicide specifically, and how it shows up in different communities. I think it's an area that nobody in the gun violence group, organization, or space is doing enough work on. But it's obviously having a huge impact and a growing impact on so many individuals. And so I appreciate you having this conversation. And yeah, it was great being shouted out by Biden, but I was shouted out as being a survivor that's trying to make a difference. And I know that there are thousands, if not millions, of other survivors out there trying to make a difference in their own way. And I'm just happy to kind of find my voice in that work. And so thankful that Sawyeh could join, another fellow survivor, but someone newer to our team, and way more knowledgeable in this issue than I am. So please listen to her. But thankful that she could join too. And I'll definitely just step back and be supportive as needed. So thanks, Mark.
Kwame, you can raise your hand with a raise hand. Jim Curry, you unmute yourself and ask a correct question.
I want to make a comment on what Jennifer was talking about the role of us as religious leaders. I'm going to make a blanket statement. I'm going to guess that most of the bishops here have been the officiants at funerals of suicide by gun. I certainly have. What I work on now is a project called Swords to Plowshares, where we take guns that come in and change them into gardening tools. Comes out of Colorado, Elizabeth, and the work of Raw Tools there. But I'm in churches now as a retired bishop every Sunday preaching about our choices. And I talk about suicide every day. And invariably, people come up and say, thank you, that we haven't had this conversation in the church, and never we had no idea that there were so many gun related suicides. But there's a thirst for exactly what Jennifer was talking about, religious leaders bringing up the conversation and then following up with it.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Rebecca Wilson, who is the principal of Canonical Communications, which works with us, Bishops United Against Gun Violence, and Bishops United Against Gun Violence would not be what we are without the work of Canonical Communications. So Rebecca, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And to be clear, I'm one of the two principals, but not the only one.
Wow.
I had a question. I had a question specifically for Sawyeh, if you have thoughts on this, and it's about the intersection of gun suicide and domestic violence. I was spending some time reading up about this, and I know that domestic violence related mass shootings, like overwhelmingly 2/3, I think was the number, and with the shooter taking their own life with a gun, and of course abusers who threaten gun violence against partners' children, often also die by gun suicide. And so it feels like there's a really complicated intersection of misogyny and all the other things that are at work in domestic violence. And I just wonder how that plays out in communities of color, and how you think we in the church should be responsive to that.
Thanks for that question. Definitely a very astute one. You're right that the majority of mass shootings include some sort of act of domestic violence. Actually, the majority of mass shootings include an explicit connection in which at least one of the victims is an intimate partner or family member. I think it's about 2/3, you're right, like you said. I also would go even further to say that there's a deep connection between misogyny, domestic violence, and hate motivated violence. We know that a lot of the hate motivated like public shootings that you can think of also were preceded by acts of domestic violence. And so what are the solutions to that? I mean, I think it's just that domestic violence needs to be a bigger part of the conversation when we talk about gun violence prevention. There are lots of, maybe not enough, but lots of policy solutions around domestic violence, such as prohibiting people who have had a misdemeanor level of domestic violence charge, not just felonies, which is there's a loophole in the law there. In many states, if your charge is not a felony level, it's just a misdemeanor level, you can just go right back out and purchase a weapon. And we know that states that make that change and kind of close that loophole do see a reduction in domestic violence homicides. Again, that focuses on the hardware, which I think, like I was saying in the beginning, we also need to think about community level interventions. I think more deeply supporting domestic violence survivors when they are believed, we are more likely to be able to prevent that perpetrator from then going on and committing even more severe acts of violence. What can the faith community do, to your question in the end? I wouldn't pretend to write prescriptions there, but I think that's a great question for the group. If anyone in the audience has any input, any ideas.
And I did just wonder for any of you, if there's a way to get at any of those important kind of interventions into domestic violence as we're talking about gun suicide, which of course is the sort of issue on the table today, because it is so frequent that men in particular take the lives of people in their families before they take their own lives with a gun. And so I just wonder if there's a way, I don't know, but I wonder if there's a way to address the way in which domestic violence and gun suicide kind of go hand in hand all too often.
Yeah, Jack McKelvey. Jackie, there we go.
There you go. I was interested, Jennifer, in a couple of things you said in particular. One was the relationship that you established with the gun organizations in Washington. And I was struck by that, if I understood what you said, that working with them, you have been able and they've been willing to take some stands to support what you're about, trying to keep guns safer around the house. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes, you did hear that correctly. And it was a very interesting experience for me as someone who is a non-gun owner, from a pretty, liberal institution where I teach, to literally cold call. And so actually a piece about this that I wrote in the Washington Post, to literally cold call the lobbyist for the NRA. And I think, even though a lot of those folks I mentioned to Mark, actually one of them I still remain very close to, who's the director of the Second Amendment Foundation, is like, I don't agree with them about a lot of things, but I do agree that we share some common humanity, and that there are things that we can do. Like no owner of firearms, I mean, unless you're talking about somebody who, obviously has involved in more criminal activity, or is, suffering the effects of trauma that leads to really bad outcomes. Like most firearm owners, they obviously they're purchasing firearms for home defense. So they haven't made this connection about suicide. And right. I think there's a broad recognition of that, like that we need to do more to protect help people who own firearms understand this. And so I did find them quite willing to engage. It's not there's certain things they'll engage in and certain things they won't. But I view any progress as it's going to be incremental, but I view any progress as a positive thing. So the kinds of things we're able to get them to do were, to work on campaigns, to provide funding for safe storage devices, to engage retailers and gun shops. A lot of educational things were very positively received. And what we learned is that a lot of how it's messaged is critically important. So again, this term gun violence, keep coming back to that, and everything that I talk about around this subject. It's like, there's nothing more off-putting to firearms owners. Like, you basically are walking in the door with a sign on your head that says, we are not culturally competent around firearms ownership when you say the word gun violence. So I just think we have to think about, deaths by firearms would be an alternative. We have to think about ways to talk about things so that we can find some common ground. We're not going to have entirely universal common ground. I know that. But there are ways to find some common ground. And I would imagine that many of the people in your communities, own firearms. And so this is a really important way to build a bridge, even within your own communities.
Yeah, and I guess that's the reason I asked the question, because it seems to me that we have a terribly difficult time making the connections with many of gun owners, because presumably they assume that they and we don't have some of the same values about some issues. And perhaps death by suicide may be one of them. I just wanted to highlight that. It caused me to think, and I'll close with this. I was in a small rural southern Delaware community right out of seminary, and was called to a family one night that the father and the son were having difficulties. And we sat and we talked. And I learned that the son had left in a huff. The next thing I knew, I looked up and the father was standing in front of me with a German Luger. And he said, I'm going to go out and get that son of a bitch. Well, I knew nothing about guns and I knew nothing about a lot of things, but I knew something about the nature of his and my relationship. And I found myself standing at the door and saying, you can't do that. You'll have to go through me to do that. I didn't know what I was saying. I trusted it. And lo and behold, after a little conversation, he handed me the gun. And then I thought to myself, what in the world am I going to do with this gun? I didn't even know how to get it out of the house into my house. And I didn't want it in my house, but I found a place that my wife and I agreed we could store it out of the reach of our kids and anybody else. And it stayed there for 6 months. So I've been more than a little bit interested in how things escalate and how quickly people lose their minds over this. So I thank you for the inroad that you're suggesting. And I'd like to think we could continue to do more work at that level.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Daniel Gutierrez.
Jennifer, I really like the connection, and I'll tell you why. Is that, I was raised on a ranch in New Mexico. We still have our ranch. And I like what you say about suicide and terminology. And I go with my uncles who pure ranchers and others are police officers. And you speak about gun control or gun violence, they automatically shift off. I mean, they stop. And then anti-rant, this and that. But they are the most conscientious gun owners I know. I mean, they lock it up. I mean, next weekend in Texas, we go hunting every year and they're careful, but every community has been affected by suicide. And I really like the connection just to open up. I meet with the NRA members here in Pennsylvania. So I was raised out west, now I'm in Philadelphia. So I tell you, I get both ends of the spectrum. And you're right, there's some things that I just cannot fathom what they believe in, but there are those bridges that we can walk together over. And I really like the connection that you have pulled together. And it's something I'm going to use here in speaking to them in Pennsylvania. So thank you. But but you're right. Even terminology, when I say gun violence or I'm a member, they just shut off, and it's becomes political, and it's opposite ends of the spectrum. So thank you.
Thank you, Danny. I have a question, and I've heard this from somebody that I work with some in New Hampshire, who's a gun rights person and who is interested in reducing suicide by guns. And he cited something, this is a question for any of the three of you, sort of the 10-minute rule, that people have an impulse to commit suicide. In 10 minutes, the impulse goes away. But in that 10 minutes, if they have access to a gun, the success rate, it's the wrong word to use, of committing suicide by guns is just very, very high. Do I have that right? 10-minute rule, or, kind of just the impulse to commit suicide. And if you can, person can get out of that impulsive place, you reduce the impact of it. Any of you know anything about that? Sawyeh?
Mark, yeah, I do. I know the study that is rooted in, more or less true, I would say. There is some evidence that the decision to attempt suicide and the attempt itself sometimes happens in a short span, but I do think it's a little bit of an undersell, because usually the decision to die by suicide or to attempt suicide is the end of a long road of suffering and unhelped suffering for a lot of people. So yes, that if we can remove the lethal means, the gun, the opportunity to act on that impulse in those moments of crisis, there is a lot of hope there. And usually somebody that survives an attempt, most often, I think about 70% don't attempt later. But if the gun is there and the lethality of that gun being around the 90% of attempts with a gun do end fatally versus about 2% of attempts with an overdose. So the means that someone reaches for in that moment is very important. But sometimes that 10-minute window, I think, is an oversimplification of many opportunities to get somebody help rather than just in that moment of crisis.
Yeah, thank
I
you.
think the important
Jen?
piece, that was a really great explanation. I think the important piece, though, is really to understand that, so removing the firearms for extended period of time, not, when someone is, because what people do have kind of thoughts when they get to reach that place of being hopeless, they will, have a crisis will ebb and flow, right? And so that's when people talk about the 10 minutes, it's like suicide crises, helping people understand that suicide crises come, and they've had several of them before, where they've, thought about suicide, thought they can't take this anymore, like they're not in a rational space, but helping people understand that there are those warning signs, those ways that people are feeling, and that eventually it comes down. But there's no 10-minute rule. And then also people have prolonged suffering, and within that there are those crises that ebb and flow, which is why it's important to kind of remove that firearm temporarily. It's particularly because people tend to not substitute means, not always, but if people get fixated on a firearm, not having that firearm available is a really nice way for them to think about a different way to cope with that pain. Mark, I did want to say one thing about the word committed suicide, because you kept saying that, and I just want to talk, because the language is so important. And so, especially in this context where the word committed, I don't know if you all talk about in the Episcopalian Church anymore, committing sins, but we really want people to understand that people who die by suicide are in very deep pain. And then we want to try to take away any language that might associate that with they're a sinner, or because there's a long history of that kind of in the church. And we want to take, the point is that we want to take away any kind of connotation that could lead people to believe that, people who die by suicide are bad people, they're sinners. Actually, they're people who are in deep, deep pain. who don't see an end to their suffering, who don't see a way out, who feel trapped. And so that language, I think, is really important to shift. So died by suicide instead of committed.
Died by suicide rather than committing suicide.
Yes.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you. Thank you. You were the one who slapped me on the wrist and said, don't use gun violence prevention. And I haven't.
Sorry, I
since.
don't mean to be like the PC police, but here I am.
No, I learned that. Yeah, it was very helpful. And Hodges-Copple, we have a few minutes left. Your hand.
Yeah, real quick. So before I was ordained, I was the shelter director for a domestic violence program here in North Carolina. So these issues are too familiar, even though that was a long time ago. So just very quickly, one of the things I would be interested in further thoughts or conversation, but probably not today, about is making me think about is how important it was that I preached on domestic violence, and how important it was to create safe space for women to talk about what they're experiencing and what they're managing. And I think that could be related to gun safety too, that often I think it is wives and girlfriends, mothers, sisters who are on the front line of intervention and maybe changing the formation. And so I think continuing to preach on Sifra and Pua, the Hebrew midwives, looking at all the biblical stories of women who found ways to leverage power in a different way, but all for the sake of a safer community. When you invest in women's health, the whole, so at some point thinking more deeply about the role of women and their partners, particularly around anger management, de-escalation. I mean, a whole host of issues could empower women, I think, on the front lines of these issues to have a more profound and empowered response in the intervention or prevention of these deaths.
Yeah, thank you. Jim Curry, and then I think we need to wind it up, and I'm going to ask when we do to ask Ian Douglas if he closes with a prayer. Jim?
My question is to Jennifer and Elizabeth. You both referenced veterans, and maybe it's opening too big of a conversation for this point, but Connecticut is a place like most of our dioceses that have military installations and lots of veterans who are living around them. And what can the church? The VA doesn't seem to be doing much. In fact, there was a news story yesterday about needing to even ask the question better about suicide as people are being separated from the services. But can you speak just a little bit about that today?
I would say the biggest thing is talking, communication, not being afraid to bring up a conversation that feels hard. I know that there's a lot of stigma around, oh, well, if I ask someone if they're suicidal, then that's going to make them want to die by suicide. And that's not true. Getting comfortable and familiar with being able to say, are you having thoughts of hurting yourself? Are you feeling suicidal? And being okay saying those words is a big thing, but also just communication around it in general about how, like Jennifer was saying, die by suicide instead of commit suicide. So there's not this stigma around it of you're a sinner, there's something wrong with you, we don't want to talk to you because you are having these thoughts, but really just letting veterans and young people and really anyone know that it's okay to talk about, and it's okay to open those lines of communication and to not feel like people are doing something wrong by doing that. I mean, as someone who did parish ministry for 10 years, I had a lot of those conversations with young people. And the more you can open those lines of communication, the easier it gets. And the more people know that this is someone or a situation, a place I can talk to about this, and it helps.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Thank you for your communications, Jennifer, Elizabeth, and Sawyeh, for what you've brought to us. This is an issue that I think is important in the church. I remember at the same suicide conference that I went and where I met Jen, schools didn't want to talk about suicide of kids who committed suicide for two reasons. One is that there are often copycat suicides, and two, they didn't want to get the word out because that the parents might start pulling their kids out of school. So it's something that's not often talked about, and I think it's the three of you plus Greg have opened up this issue in a vital way. So again, thank you. And Ian, if I might invite you as co-convener of Bishops United Against Gun Violence to offer a prayer as we wind up our time.
Thank you, Mark. Happy to pray us out. And before I do, I also want to extend my appreciation to Jennifer, Sawyeh, and Elizabeth and Greg for being here and facilitating this really important conversation. And also thanks to you, Mark, for your good and faithful work as a liaison and as helping us to connect as Bishops United Against Gun Violence to a wider network of concern and love as we've experienced it here today. So thank you, Mark, for your effort putting this together. So the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Loving God, God of life and God of possibility, give you thanks for the privilege and opportunity to come together in your name, to discuss how best to support people, particularly those who are considering ending their life by suicide. Thank you for giving us resources to support those who are in such a crisis circumstance and for their families and loved ones, for giving us new thoughts and new language and new opportunities to work together in your mission of reconciliation and restoration. We pray, O God, that you will use us as religious leaders, as Bishops United Against Gun Violence, and those who are committed to addressing the ongoing epidemic of death caused by firearms in our nation. Be with us in this struggle and bless us in this work, so that all that we do may extend your reign of love for all people. We ask this in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen.